What a great time after Easter. You know, I don't know, it's fast, wasn't it? I feel like there's so much buildup. We got this whole thing called Lent, this 40 days, this buildup toward Easter, and it feels like we're moving toward it, and then, bam, isn't it over just before you know it? Feels like that was kind of fast, right? Like, Easter's come and gone. We packed it all up. You know, after our service last week, we had a great time of fellowship. The Easter eggs were out there. Isabel's out there like, we got to get the eggs. We had such a good time, and then, we started packing some things up. We started cleaning up, and I think before 6 o'clock for sure, we're already back to like normal here. Can you see this? All the palm trees, like we had a veritable forest up here, didn't we? And it's just kind of like that season of Easter. It's such an amazing season, and the culmination, the exclamation point of our Kingdom series, where we're all shouting, He is risen. That's what I'm talking about right there. But it felt like it kind of flew by, didn't it? And at the same time, it almost feels like it's been a while since Easter now, hasn't it? You had anything happen this week since Easter? I don't know. I like this trend that I saw on social media, all these posts. A lot can happen in a week. Did y'all see any of those? A lot can happen in 3 days. I like that. But now as we're on the other side of Easter, a lot can happen in a week, right? And I want to look at Luke 24 today. I want to look at this, what happens, what's next. That's really what I want us to think about is what's next. We're in the moment where maybe some of you are still in that Easter place, but maybe some of you, a lot can happen in a week. Might have been through some things here this week. And so in Luke chapter 24, what we have is it begins, right, and there's the story of the resurrection. And Jesus is risen. He's not in the tomb. It is empty. The disciples go to check it out. And then all of a sudden it goes to this story about on the road to Emmaus, which is a really interesting story, right? Because Jesus comes alongside two disciples that are traveling to this road about 7 miles away. He appears, but he's incognito. And then he's asking questions like, hey, what you guys talking about? Don't you love that sense of humor? Hey, what's going on, guys? What are you talking about? Like, don't you know? And so there's this dialogue where Jesus is there and he says, don't you know all this stuff had to happen? You remember all the conversations we had about what was going to have to happen, about what the Messiah was going to go through? And then as they sit down for dinner, they realize, oh, it's him, and he disappears. It's such a weird story, and there are so many of these, and I think the familiarity can kind of gloss over how strange that some of this is, because it should have us ask some questions. And so that's what happens in Luke 24 in those first two sections. I want us to take a minute to dig into the third section where Jesus appears to the disciples, the 11, and they're back in the room. But before I do that, there are some striking things about this. Did you know all this happened on the same day? Did you know that? It's the same day. The same day. So early in the morning they're there. He's not here. He's risen. The same day, Jesus appears on the road to Emmaus. And in the same evening, Jesus shows up to meet the disciples in the room where he had left them. How wild is that? And so I think about that and I say, it's the same day. Well, what's with the gaps in the stories? How come Jesus isn't at the tomb right there like, I'm here, Like, why does he have to be absent there? Why does he have to be hidden on the road? Why does he appear to the two disciples on the road and not the 11 of, like, his closest inner circle? Why didn't he just appear to them first? And, the Bible causes us to ask some of these questions, but one of the themes it pulls out is that the disciples are shocked and in disbelief. I find that odd, because of how much Jesus talks about the things that he has to go through. And yet, the disciples are like, whoa, something weird's going on, y'all. Something strange is happening. And they're like in shock and they're in disbelief. And that in and of itself is kind of strange. But all of these kind of things, if we put ourselves in the position of the disciples, they're all in that position asking the question, all right, what's next? Jesus is risen, but what comes next? Okay, the tomb is empty, but what's next? And I find the way that you ask that question of what's next says everything. It's how you ask that question. And I want to look at that here in Luke 24. In verse 36, it picks up. And what I want to do is I want to take you back to the table. Do you remember the table that was out here? Thursday before last, Maundy Thursday, we all gathered around. We celebrated in the setting, and we were reminded of the disciples and Jesus' final night with the disciples, where he teaches, where they have communion, where they start to understand who he is, right? He washes their feet. They break the bread. He gives the wine. Like, there is this amazing thing that happens before all of the chaos, the madness, the sacrifice that happens that weekend. And I want us to go back to the table because there's something about Jesus bringing the disciples back at that table. And in verse 36, this is where Jesus appears to the disciples. And so again, this is all the same day. So resurrection, road to Emmaus, and then in verse 36 it picks up, it says, while they were still talking about this, meaning the appearance on the road as they ran back to tell them about it, it says, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. It says they were startled and frightened, thinking that they'd seen a ghost. And he said to them, why are you troubled? Why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands, look at my feet. It's I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. You know, I think this is interesting. Jesus appears, peace be with you, and they're terrified, thinking that they saw a ghost. And it's just wild to me how the disciples are constantly surprised at how this is all going down. I mean, I know it's miraculous, but Jesus definitely told them what was going to happen, and yet they're still surprised. I think there's something about us processing those moments after Easter. There's something about us being at the table there, right? Because they go back to the table scene. Why? Because that's the place they were last with Jesus. So they go back to the table. But they're still processing and they're not understanding and things are not clear. And that's where Jesus himself shows up. And I have to believe that the disciples showed up and said, okay, what's next? Right? I mean, isn't that why they all came back to the room? Maybe they had nowhere else to go. Maybe they just didn't know where to go. But they all come back to that table, back to that room. And they say, okay, but what's next? I think if you ask the question of what's next, looking at the past is one way to do it. As in, had some hard stuff happen this week. What's next? Right? And another. It's like the things that I can't handle in life. Yet another disruption, yet another time that my plans did not go according to the way that I wanted them to, yet another time that tragedy strikes, yet another time that I am just struggling. And I have to say, oh, what next? It's like it's adding up. It's like we're taking the hits. It's like a boxer just getting punched, right? It's just like, ugh. And sometimes life comes at us like that, you know? I mean, the truth is that a lot of people, we struggle in life. It's what it means to be a human. That's part of the whole experience here on planet Earth, you know? We struggle. I mean, there are people here in our church that struggle, are struggling now. Some of you might be those people that are struggling. Struggles, I mean, it's tough, you know, and it comes in all shapes and sizes. I mean, whether it's your health, your finances, you know, struggle is real. You know, this week for me, a lot can happen in a week, y'all. Had such a great Easter service, you know, and Monday, driving, check engine light. Oh, don't you hate that check engine light? Just want to ignore it forever? You know you probably shouldn't. Okay, so I take it in, right? And they're looking at it, all right, I think we should be able to get this fixed up for you. All right, great. So next day I get a call. Well, yeah, I don't know what's going on. We're kind of confused. Okay. We're going to have to do some more detective work. We're probably going to have to pull out a bunch of parts, and we're going to check some other stuff, and then, you know, but I'll let you know. We'll probably get it done. Okay. I mean, hey, you know, it is what it is. Isn't that what we tell ourselves, right? Like, okay, all right. I mean, it's super inconvenient for me. My only vehicle, but, you know, okay. Then the next day comes. I got some bad news, buddy. Like, oh, no. We're going to have to replace a bunch of stuff we're talking about thousands of dollars here. It's a big problem. You definitely have to get this stuff done. And I say, well, all right. I mean, what are you going to do, right? Got to get it done. And then another, but that's okay. You can pay the money. Get it all fixed up. It's going to be great. All right, well, I'll suck it up. I'll figure it out. We'll find out how this is all going to work together, but we will do it. Go ahead and make it happen. And then the next day I get another call. Well, we did all that work, but it didn't fix it. And you're sitting there like, a hit after a hit after a hit. And he says, it's kind of weird, and he's hedging this whole time, right? He's kind of trying to soften the blow, I can tell. And he says, we tried, and that was probably good, but it didn't really work, and it's probably going to need some more, and so we're really not sure. It's super mysterious. We really don't know what's going on, but you're going to need a new engine. Boom! Knockout, right? TKO. And you're just like, oh. And then I'm thinking, how am I going to handle this? How am I do this? And to be honest, right, in the grand scheme of life, it's just a car. I'll probably figure it out. But in the moment, it sure doesn't feel like that. It's like, oh, just another blow. And every time I picked up that phone, you know what was going through my head? All right, what's next, right? And it's this sense of dread and anxiety, right? And I wonder if the disciples aren't in that room thinking that same way of all right, okay, what's next? Oh, what's next? Brace yourself, my mom on Monday went into the hospital for some surgery. Fused some vertebrae in her neck. Everything went good, so that's good. She's on the mend, but, there's recovery time after this, And at first it's I'm fine, right? You got you pumped full of all sorts of stuff. You're only about half awake anyways. I'm doing pretty good. I feel like I'm feeling a lot better than I thought I would. And then as that starts to wear off and they kind of taper you out of that section of the surgery, right? You kind of okay, I'm in a little pain. It gets less and less comfortable. And then it's, all right, it's time to start some rehab. Oh, they're going to work. They're going to work you in rehab. They're going to make you work. And it's good for you, right? But it's just oh, what's next? Okay, now we're going to walk. Now we're going to walk a little further. Now we're going to do some more stretches. And everything kind of starts adding up to where you just start thinking oh, what's next? And I don't know, I think about these disciples being kind of hunkered in the room, and the way that they're asking this what's next question is thinking what's next? They're looking in the past, aren't they? Every time I answer that phone from the mechanic going, oh, what's next, right? The sense of dread that's over, what I'm doing is I'm thinking about all the stuff that's accumulating to me. And when I say, well, what's next? I'm really just thinking, how do I survive the kind of stuff that I've just been through? So one way that we ask that question of what's next is looking backwards and looking at all of the struggle. But there's another way that you can ask what's next, and that's really in the moment. We touched on that a little bit earlier. In this next section where Jesus comes in verse 40 and he says, when he'd said this, he showed them his hands and feet, and while they still did not believe because of joy and amazement, he asked them, do you have anything to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish. He took it, he ate it in their presence, and then he said to them, this is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And so this idea of saying, well, what's next is in the present. It's I'm unsure. I don't know what's going on. What is next? I have no idea. And yet Jesus is saying, we talked about this, guys. Remember? What's next? We are at the exact point I told you we would be at. And some of them don't realize, I'll eat some food. Why? Because every time the angels are appearing in the Bible, they don't eat food. And what he's telling them is no, I'm here right now in the flesh. Give me some food. I'm here, I'm alive, fully. And it's this great moment, but it's back at the table, and Jesus loves to come back to the table. He says, come on back. We've been through a lot. There's been a lot of things that have happened. A lot can happen in a week. And yet he brings them right back to the table. He says, I'm here, I'm alive. All of these things are the things that I told you would have to happen. And here we are yet again, eating at the table. It's saying, really remember the moment. Be in the moment that's right there. Be in the present. And we say, what's next? It's okay, what's next? I'm unsure, I don't know what to do. Maybe they're feeling a little bit lost. Maybe they're just a little bit confused. But in that moment, what Jesus is doing is saying, okay, here we are. And they say, okay, right? Like we're back at the table. We're back in this moment with Jesus. He's trying to say that you knew the struggle would happen. And yet he's there with comfort and reassurance to connect to them. But when we ask the question of what's next, we can be looking backwards. We can kind of be in the moment where we feel a little lost, confused, or unsure. But really we want to go toward the what's next in the truest sense, which is looking into the future. And in verse 45, it says, right after that, it says, then he opened their minds so they could understand the Scriptures. He told them, this is what's written. The Messiah must suffer and will rise from the dead on the third day. And repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in the name to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you've been clothed with power from on high. And then it is, what is next? You see, there's actually this thing that's going to happen, and Jesus says, remember, it's all of those things, but now wait here for the next thing. And now the disciples are saying, okay, what's next? You see, they're starting to catch this vision of what is going to happen. Jesus is saying, I'm going to send you what my Father has promised. You are the witnesses of all these things. You have walked through all these things because now that means that you're going to go do something. You weren't just present in part of this inner circle. You weren't just part of this story that happened, this singular moment in time that completely changed the world and the universe. You weren't just there just because you're there because you have something to go do. And so now they're looking forward. They're saying, okay, well, what is next? It's a different way to ask the question of what's next. It is what makes us different as Christians in this world. We are able to say what's next with a sense of hope and optimism looking into the future, and not only being even prisoners of the moment, and not only looking back at all of the trauma and the struggle and all the hurdles we had to get over with that sense of dread and anxiety. In our world today, to say, well, what's next with hope and optimism looking forward, that's a different way to look, right? It's this energizing next step. It's saying, yeah, what's next? Like that makes me excited. Like, yeah, what does God have next for me? Look at what God's doing in my life now, and well, what's coming next? What is next? It's another blessing and another blessing. It's, I went through some stuff, and look what God did to get me through that. Look how I came out of that. And when Jesus says it opens their mind to the Scriptures, they start to see the big picture. They start to see the big story. But it's not just so they could be smarter. They see the big story so they can put themselves into that story. He opens their minds so that they can see possibility. He wants them to be hopeful to see what is up ahead. And it's not all going to be comfortable and just perfect and super easy all the time, but it is exciting and it is good, and that's what Jesus invites us into, because they see the truth of the situation, the reality around them. Our world today struggles to see hope and optimism, doesn't it? We have a unique perspective to share because of this story of Jesus, because we've seen it, we've lived it, we've experienced it, and we're called, says, you are the witnesses to these things. Yeah, what's next? Who do I get to talk to about that, right? Because this chapter really, it ends up here, we're talking about the good news ahead, we're future focused, and we're saying what's next. What we should be thinking about is what is mission. When Jesus he says, I've called you, and I'm also sending you. Jesus didn't just call us just to gather only. He calls us to gather, but to go out. You see, we're supposed to be a people on mission to spread the gospel, and how do we do that? You don't need fancy education and training. You need to be able to share the story of Jesus in your own life. And every Christian can do it, because every Christian has met Jesus. And when you tell people about what Jesus has done in your life, that starts to catch fire, like we heard earlier, right? Something happens when you share your story about who Jesus is that's more important than any of the theological principles that are here. Most people's lives are changed, and most people are really connected when you tell them a story from the heart, There's something about you being able to tell a story about a tough time in your life, and even something as simple as like, my car. there's something that connects in that moment, right? That we can share the story because we're witnesses to what God has done in our life. And if we see the truth of it, and we let Jesus open our minds, and we walk with him, and we trust him, what happens is, I'm actually not that worried about what's going to happen. I mean, maybe I just get to buy a new car, y'all. How are we going to pay for that? I don't know. We're going to figure it out. Something's going to happen here. But point is like, that's not the end, because I've walked with Jesus through much harder things. You know, part of that for me with the car thing is because I remember when I was younger, the car was like, I didn't have any money to do any kind of repairs on a car at all. Some of you know what I'm talking about. It's just like, I cannot afford not an oil change right now. And so that's a little triggering for me because I'm like, oh no, my car. But how God has provided for me over the years, how he continues to provide for me and changes my mindset towards some of these things. You know, I'll give you another example, right? Like, you know, and I hear John. I always think about John when I think about the principle of tithing. He's such a great example and such a good steward of what God's given him in life and has great stories around it, right? But, you know, not everybody, maybe you are just now starting to tithe. Maybe you've never really trusted God fully with that. Maybe you're like, oh, I'll trust him maybe halfway. But there's something about that, right? Like, the second that you commit to that and you say, you can draft my monthly account, or you say, every time I'm going to church, I'm going to drop that in that offering basket. Like, when you do that, there's a certain amount of, like, you have to come to a place of peace and you say, okay, I'm going to trust God now, and God's going to take care of things. Would you be surprised that a big old bill comes up right after that? Well, you shouldn't be, because that's kind of how this works, you know? It's like, oh, you know, I need to start saving for my future. I need to start putting a little bit more money into that retirement account, right? Thinking about Isabel growing up. I just make sure I shift that. I mean, wouldn't it make a lot of sense that a big bill unexpectedly would come up right after I do that? There's something about walking with God where we have to say, like, I know you're going to take care of it, and it changes the way that we engage. And so when we think about what's next, it's not a feeling of dread, it's not prisoner of the moment, it's something that's forward thinking. It's knowing that there's hope and a future ahead for us. And so when Jesus calls us to be witnesses, we have work to be doing. And so this chapter ends in verse 50. It says, when he led them out to the vicinity of Bethany, it says he lifted up his hands and he blessed them. And while he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up into heaven. It says, then they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they stayed continually at the temple, praising God. You see, there's something about when Jesus comes and blesses us. Our blessings, the blessings on our life, and this is not the money sermon, y'all. I want you to put this into bigger context. I want you to think bigger picture. When Jesus blesses us and brings us through the trouble of our life, the things that we struggle with, the things that take us captive in the moment, the things that hold us prisoner, the things that isolate and separate us from the people around us, when Jesus comes and stretches his hands and blesses you, all of that worry starts to turn into joy. And joy starts turning into worship moments and thankfulness. And like, at a certain point, it gets really weird because tragedy will strike and you'll even say, you know what? I think I'm going to get through this. I think that I'm going to be okay. I think God's actually got this under control and I'm not worried. I know people right now struggling in our church, and that's their perspective. Tragedy hits, something unexpected, like, I know God's got something great planned. And you sit there and go, what? But it's tragedy, right? Like, don't you want to like wallow in that for a little while, like just be sad and get some sympathy from other people? No, they don't need that. Because they know that God's going to provide because they have this whole story with God. And part of their witness is saying, even in the midst of this, as bad as it may look, I know who God is, and I know that God's got my back, and he's going to provide for me. And so the blessings turn to joy. And that's what we're called to be in this world. We're called to be a blessing to others. We're called to love people well. Our world is not going to change by somebody berating people down and telling them how wrong they are and arguing with them. No one's heart has ever been transformed by a good argument. Y'all know that? It's disappointing to some of you, I know. There's a part of me that's very disappointing too. But you know I'm right? Doesn't matter, you know? Like if we're talking about really changing people's lives and changing their hearts, it's about us being the blessing. It's It's about us showing this unbelievable, ridiculous, unrestricted love of God. That love, to say that it doesn't matter who you are, and it doesn't matter what you've done, and that no matter what, I love you. To be able to actually look at the people around us in our lives, as stubborn and as hard-headed as they may be, but to actually look at them and say, I love you through that lens where it's, I love you and I'm fighting for you and I want to be a blessing to you. And so that's why I'm praying for you. Because it's not about being right, it's about being a blessing. It's not about us winning the argument, it's about us loving other people well. That will change a life. You share a story and love people well, that is the recipe for transformation in the lives of others. And we know as the church, that's our role. That's what we're here to do. We're here to love well, to be a blessing to those around us. That's really what Jesus calls us into, you know. And then it says the disciples that they worship, right? They're so overcome with joy that they want to worship, right? I think a lot of the time when we talk about what it means to worship, you can get some real churchy type definitions from people, you know. And that's okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I also like to think of worship in very practical terms, right? Like, worship to me is just telling Jesus thank you. It's gratitude. It's a Christian life. It's realizing, like, I'm not in control. I don't make everything happen on my own because I follow Jesus. And so I want him to know, like, thank you for what you're doing for me. Thanks for guiding me through it, and I know you're going to get me through whatever's going on right now, too. We come together to worship and to pray so we could just say thank you to God. It's also so we just express our joy, but it's also how we share our story. Saying thank you, sharing our story, expressing joy. These are ways to be a blessing and to love well in our world. And in Matthew 28, there's the Great Commission, you know? We've seen that, right? It's that Jesus is really sending us out into the world. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. The mission could not be more clear. We are called to be good witnesses, to share love and blessing to others in the world. That is who we are as disciples, Jesus followers. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We follow such a generous and good God. How dare we keep it all for ourselves, you know? Our world is hurting bad in lots of different ways. The people that are around you in your different circles as you leave this place, right? We all go to kind of our own bubbles of people. In those, like, you know that there are people that are struggling, that are hurting. The message of hope and love that we have is like nothing else. And the problem is there's adversity in our world, which means there's a lot of counter stories, right? There's other narratives that are being spun. And these people that are hurting and lost and broken are hearing that there are other solutions to their problems, ones that actually put them further into bondage. But we have the good news. Like, the gospel is good news. Why? God loves everybody. I mean, there's not better news than that. I think the other part, when I think about this idea of looking forward and saying, what's next? We call that mission, don't we? It's about mission, and what I love about the idea of mission is there's clarity. Like the disciples, they're not unsure anymore. They're not just looking in the past. They're looking forward and saying, like, okay, go, make disciples, baptize, teach, go out. I am with you. You know, there's a clarity that comes from that mission and really embracing what God's doing in each of our life. Walking with Jesus everywhere we go, because each of us are called to go and to tell, to share our story, to be a blessing, to bring joy. Sharing the good news. That's what we're called to do as Christians. It means that what's next is good, and that there is hope and healing and life ahead. And when I think of what's next, such a good question. What's next for the sick in our world? What's next is healing. That's really what Jesus is saying today. And maybe that's not linear and it's not immediate. Maybe there's some ups and downs going, but we know that God is our healer. We trust in that. We pray for it. Today we're going to pray for some of the people that are hurting, that are sick. What's next for the people that are feeling broken? Well, the truth is that there's restoration. What's next is that God can bring healing and wholeness and transformation. You don't have to stay broken. That's the promise of following Jesus. What's next for maybe someone that feels lost in our world today? There are a lot. Well, as Christians, what comes next is community, connectedness, a sense of purpose, tapping into that mission of who we are as Christians and what we're called to be doing in our world. Don't get distracted. We have a clear mission. There's a purpose for us. We're connected to the different people in our life in those different circles because we have something to be doing in those spaces. What's next for some of the indifferent in our world? Life with Jesus? What's next can be that sense of purpose and mission, So many people are apathetic, like, I just kind of want to do the easy thing. It's not really the way of Jesus sometimes. It's really weird. Sometimes you got to do the hard thing and let Jesus take the lead, and that's actually harder, but he'll do the work. I think about the burdened, right? What's next for the burdened? Well, we have to say that God's good, and we got to know that, as heavy as those burdens can be, Jesus is promising to say, I'm right here with you, always, to the end of the age. Jesus is here to walk alongside us and help us carry those burdens until we find healing and we're fully free of it, right? This is good news right here. And when I think about, what's next for Spirit of Life? I have to say I'm very confident it's something good, I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know exactly what it is, and I don't think it may not be linear. There may be ups and downs, right? But we know that God is walking us out. We know that God is here and will use us as the people to be a blessing to others. And so I think when I look ahead, I say, well, what's next is something good. And that's really the thought I wanted to leave you with, right? What's next is good. Living with a sense of hope and optimism in our world today it's odd. It will make you different than everyone else around you. When you say, I'm ready for what's next. I can't wait for what God's going to be doing in my life. I don't see tragedy as just setbacks. I know that God can be opening up doors that I would have never thought possible. So may you be blessed and full of joy, right? As Jesus raises his hand and blesses you, have that joy, embrace it, and then be that blessing to others. Having worship that's full of gratitude, knowing that Jesus is truly with you, because we know what's next is going to be good. Amen.